We have a world-renowned list of panelists that will present their perspectives regarding how to build an effective research toolkit for success as an early career academic HPB surgeon. My name is Josh Dada. I'm a HPB surgical oncologist and cancer immunologist at the University of Miami. I'm thrilled to co-moderate this session with Alex Ganji, who will introduce herself in just a minute. But I want to just give you an overview of this webinar. In this webinar, our plan is to outline diverse paths to a successful career as an academic HPB surgeon, highlight the essential ingredients necessary to build effective research teams and develop a compelling research motif to communicate your science, and finally provide insights into the funding pipeline, both from the perspective of the funding agencies as well as the applicant. And overall, we hope this webinar will equip you with the tools to be successful in your quest to develop into an effective academic HPB surgeons. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Try to keep yourself muted if possible. We will have 2 opportunities to ask questions to the speakers. So please keep the questions coming. Alex and I will moderate the questions. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Zhenjian Ye from the University of North Carolina. She really needs no introduction. She's a continually funded basic and translational pancreatic surgeon scientist, having made seminal discoveries about molecular classification and epithelial plasticity in pancreatic cancer. We're thrilled that she is here tonight to provide her insights into tools necessary to kickstart your early career in basic and translational hepatobiliary science. Dr. Ye.
Thank you, Josh. I don't know that I am capable of doing that. But it's really, what's really inspiring is seeing everybody who signed up for the webinar. So it's inspiring to see so many people who are interested. What screen are you seeing? I'm gonna just do this. Is that good?
Perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
awesome. All right. So Josh asked me to give a talk that I've actually never given before, and that's like steps to a successful research career. And, it's sort of trial and error, but I can sort of tell you what I went through and lessons learned. And I am more than happy to take questions or speak offline about this. If I didn't cover enough and you want more detail, please just chime in. Happy to have more discourse. So, I think what is really clear at all institutions is that there is a dearth of physician scientists, and it is a dying breed. And so the good news is that there's a lot of foundations, I think, and the NCI as well, right? They have the surgeon scientist effort that Martha Zeiger is heading to really increase the pipeline from fellowship, residency onward. So I think that there's a lot of support to sort of revitalize physician scientists and their success. But this is an interesting article that is very timely. It's written by Christopher Williams is the first author, but there's a few people on here that Peter Ratcliffe is the Nobel Prize winner for oxygen sensing a couple of years ago, along with Bill Kalin as well. And Kim Rathmel is the chief of medical oncology at Vanderbilt. And so they wrote this article that I'll show you a table of, but it basically sort of talks about, what the opportunities are. And I think certainly, and I won't detract from the rest of the talks, but I think certainly as sort of basic translational researchers, we have a ton of opportunities because we can certainly publish in the scientific sort of basic literature, the translational literature. We can, publish in the clinical space as well, and in sort of the prevention space. So I think that we have a lot of opportunities as research on sort of the bench side and the to really capitalize on where we can publish and where our grants can be. And so I think that's an opportunity that we should really think about and take advantage of as research people on the bench side. But this article talks a little bit about training and what we need to be trained in order to be a successful physician scientist. And I think that a lot of this will resonate. And I will only touch on a few of these, but networking, mentor training, research management, how to promote science, which, Dr. Dada is really great at, so I will not touch on. I should learn from that. Resiliency is something that we all need, DEI and team science. And so we'll touch on a little bit of this, but this is a typical timeline. And as many of you know, I'm in cancer. And so I'm like really focused on the cancer societies. So forgive me for leaving out other opportunities, but most of you have gotten fellowships in residency. You can continue to get fellowships in your clinical fellowships as well. And then you start to think about your transition. What are you going to do as you finish fellowship? Few and some will be successful at writing a KO8 before you hit your job. But most of us aren't in a position to write a KO8 as we finish our fellowships. Once you hit your institution, most institutions are going to have like pre-K opportunities. So you should look into those. Many times you won't see it on the surgery side, you'll see it on the medical oncology side, but usually, or on the medicine side, but usually it's for all specialties. So you should be able to take advantage of that. Physician scientist training programs are popping up. There's at least 7 or 8 institutions in the country with physician scientist training programs, which are basically institutionally supported pre-K programs to get you to a KO8. And that's sort of the first, I guess, rung of the ladder that you sort of want to hit. But one thing that you don't want to forget is that as you hit your initial faculty appointment, you have a plethora of opportunities for you. Surgical societies, absolutely, but there's also your field specific societies. I've listed some of the cancer, more cancer focused society. The Burroughs Wellcome Fund has really started an initiative for physician scientists, both at the fellowship level and the early faculty level. So all of those are like fantastic opportunities that you should take advantage of as you're in that early career stage. I think it's a great time. But it's definitely hard, right? You have to juggle a lot of things when you first hit your early faculty. And this is, many of you have probably seen this is from the NIH, and this is by age of when you get your first R01. So do not be disillusioned. We are, as MDs or MD PhDs, we tend to fall about 5 to 8 years behind our PhD counterparts before we get our R01, which makes sense, right? Because you're training and you're getting your fellowship. But I do want to sort of focus on this slide just a little bit, because I think you wouldn't expect somebody, for instance, who did their PhD in pancreatic cancer and wanted to switch to be a surgeon, right, to just sort of have an accelerated course in surgery, right? You sort of have to learn the tools of surgery again. And I think the flip side is probably true for our bench-based scientists as well. So I think my first words of wisdom to you is to figure out what tools you need and learn it firsthand. And this goes to mentoring, because if you don't know the tools that you're using and haven't used them before, it's harder as a mentor to mentor somebody through that, right? So it's harder to be that person who's dictating your research, what research you want done, when you don't sort of have the sort of building blocks, I guess, of any technique or any method that you're trying to teach. So opportunities to learn your tools firsthand, especially as an early faculty or as a sort of when you're finishing your fellowship, are really good opportunities, especially when you're, you might change institutions. Really think about that skill set that you need. And that goes with finding a mentor. You're going to become a mentor. You're probably already a mentor, but it's really important to find a mentor who's both a collaborator and a sponsor. And sometimes that's difficult to do when you're interviewing. But one thing that you want to think about is, I tell our trainees all the time, who do you want to be? Like, what is the kind of research that you want to do? What are the skill sets that you need? And so you don't necessarily need to find a mentor that's interested in what you're doing. You might have a project in mind. Actually, your best mentor may be the mentor that's maybe somewhat relevant, but actually is going to give you different expertise in terms of methods, techniques, maybe just grant writing. Maybe you have like a super great grant writer that you want to learn from. And maybe they're in the same field, or maybe they're in a completely different field, but they're going to give you some expertise that you really need for your research. And that actually makes a really, really awesome collaborator because you are complementary, right? And you're not working on the same thing, which then sort of brings you to your independence phase. For myself, research clearly, techniques, methods, the scientific field just, is incredibly rapid. So every time we have a gap in our training, we get sort of behind and need to catch up. For me, the first few years I spent in Channing Durr's lab, there was a project that he needed somebody to work on. I was interested in it. I was going to learn about RAS, but I had sort of my own ideas already. So we had I had a startup. You should get a startup. I had a technician to sort of do both my project that I wanted to start as well as his project. He wasn't really interested in what I was doing except peripherally. And I was very interested in the project that I ended up working on with him. And so I got different skill sets by working in that lab for a few years before I got my R01. And so it was perfect. We still collaborate, we're complementary. It works out really, really well. Those of you who are at MSK, Dr. Brennan in meetings always asks you, are you asking the right question? And I think that is so true for research. You have to ask the right question. You have to listen to your data. And, once you look at your data, it's never what you think it should be. It's never what you expect. And so you really have to just go back and reassess. Are you actually asking the right question? And I think Dr. Brennan was so wise when he talked about that, because it's something that we just use all the time in terms of thinking about things. I'll notice trainees coming through my lab, could be PhDs or or MDs or residents. You sort of end up wanting your data to show something, and you're so convinced that your data shows that, but it's really important to reevaluate, because when you go to peer review or when you're trying to publish, somebody else is going to be that objective voice, and you want that objective voice for yourself, right, before you have to go to peer review. And so most of you in leadership positions now, we hear about SWOT analysis all the time. And as Josh was asking me to give this talk, I was sort of thinking, well, what do we actually consider when we're writing papers and grants, or just putting together a project? And one thing I think that is really important to do is to figure out what tools do you have available to you, what data do you have, and what expertise do you have, whether it be your expertise, your collaborators' expertise, and how do you put these stories together? Because there's many ways to get to the same endpoint, but there's also many stories that you can do, that you can work on. And I think that's really important. I think one thing that, a good example for me is when I was at MSK, I just did clinical research. And you know what? Like, there was nobody to do statistics with us, other Mithat Gonen, who's at MSK, would, he was an incredibly great help. But, on a sort of a working level, I still had to figure out how to do my own statistics. So I sat there with a statistical book. Mithat was sort of like my mentor, and did the statistics. But you know what? Those tools, right, have become one of the strengths and have allowed us to be successful at looking at big data and understanding big data and combining sort of clinical and molecular work. And so use your tools and see how you can sort of complement them. People are going to see your gaps. What are the gaps? What are your peers doing? What are they? What is their research on? Where are they in terms of publications and such? You need to sort of look at that and have some insight in terms of where you need to be. Look at the field. I think that as researchers, we have a ton of opportunities. So find your niche, because there are niches. And there are more than one niches, I think, that you can capitalize on, especially as a surgeon scientist. I'm not going to talk about threats because there are many and we feel them all the time. I think that's a whole nother conversation. But the most important thing I want to get across is that to be successful, I think you have to hedge your bets. So anything that you do, you want to be able to capitalize on multiple points. So multiple shots on goal. If you have a finding, what other questions can you ask with it? Can you ask 3 questions with it instead of going straight linearly into the next step? Can you sort of branch out? So multiple shots on goal is really important. I'll tell you that like my office neighbor who just got recruited to UT Southwestern, he's a PhD, but you know, what he did was he put 3 R01s in as an ESI, right? And he got 2 of them funded before at the same time, right? So he got ESI status on 2 of his R01s. Now, I would never have been able to do that, but I think that's a really good example of trying to like not just synergize your science, but sort of synergize your timing, and definitely be resilient. You know, my stack of rejections is bigger than this, right? And these are the grants that actually finally get funded. So do not be disillusioned. This like happens to everybody. You're going to get a ton, but the big thing is you have to be insightful. You want to step back because, you know, if somebody said that, you know, what you have is stupid or wrong, you know, of course, that's sort of a little rude, right? But you want to think about what did you not get across that made them think that, right? What did you do? What did you write? How can you write better to get your point across? And I think that that's sort of the best thing that somebody really, and I can't remember, probably many people have told me that, but don't take it personally, right? You just got to sort of put yourself in the reviewer position. Why did they think that? Did you like make them confused? Like, you know, how better should you write to take somebody through it? And that's, I think, the learning point as you sort of write grant after grant after grant. And I don't know what my timing is, but the other thing that I will say that I made a mistake in when I first started is not publishing soon enough. So publish, because once you get your first grant, you're not going to get your second grant unless you have publication. So you can't, you know, as surgeons, we're really good at meeting deadlines. I'm really good at like trying to get the next grant, but at some point, you know, you have to produce in order to get your next grant. So stop, reassess, get some papers out, even if they're not going to be super high impact. You have to show that you've been productive, because once you have a couple of awards on your CV, people are going to be like, what did you do with them? Have you been productive with them? And so, you know, at the end, right, this is sort of the holy grail for many, is you finally arrive when you've gotten your R01. But you know what? It's not the end, because it just goes on and on and on. But there's so much to learn, right? The scientific and clinical fields keep on evolving, and there's just so much to learn. And I think one thing that Josh had brought up was sort of ongoing learning, ongoing skill sets. And I think that I am always learning. You know, didn't do very well in immunology in med school, and definitely having to learn a little bit about immunology these days. I should probably take a course with Josh. But there are just so many different things and so many different directions, right, that your research can go in, that you always have to learn. And those of you who don't have PhDs, your PhD counterparts sort of already have a foundation in this. And so that's sort of where that advantage comes in. And we sort of, in order to be competitive, we really have to learn these different fields that we're interested in going in, that diving into. So always reassess, have personal insight, be resilient, absolutely. Collaborations are great. You're going to have some bad ones, there's some good ones, keep your good ones. And feedback is really important. Don't take it personally. And generally, you know, it never, you know, you always have like negative people who are telling you about your writing, et cetera. Don't take it personally. Take the feedback and improve on it. And the other thing is, you know, multiple shots on goal, team science actually really works. You know, I think one thing very early on, there were a lot of people who introduced me to people around the country, surgeons, scientists, and that has really helped. Those collaborations have stayed. And while they're writing a grant, they're including you, right? And so you're going to have a little bit of buffer when somebody else is writing the grant and you're a part of that. And collaborations that go both ways are awesome. And I'll just end with, I'm sorry if I am over time, but I think all of you who are listening have a really great opportunity to look at the big picture. I think that is your niche. And so how do you put the different pieces of the puzzle together with all these different specialties. Like if you're going to have a lot of collaborators, you might be the person that sees that big picture. And that's why you'll be successful. So thank you. And happy to take questions when it's discussion time.
Thank you, Dr. Ye. That was great. For those of you that joined a little bit later, you'll be able to ask questions at 2 different time points, and you can feel free to post your questions in the chat at the appropriate time. Next, we have Dr. Hari Nathan, who is a surgical oncologist and division chief of the hepatopancreaticobiliary surgery service at the University of Michigan. He also focuses on health services research studying variations in cost and quality of surgical care, and has had national funding to study the impact of Medicare payment policy innovations on the costs and quality of surgery. We look forward to hearing his talk on the path to health services research. Dr. Nathan.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks, Dr. Ganji and Dr. Dada, for inviting me to participate in this. I appreciate it. So, you know, I was asked to talk about building a toolkit for success as an early career academic HPB surgeon. I'm not sure that doing it as an academic HPB surgeon, as opposed to any other type of academic surgeon, is necessarily all that different. And, you know, I think rather than try to exhaust every possible variation of how you might do this, I'll tell you about how I did it, acknowledging that, you know, that's just one way. But hopefully that will spur some questions and some good discussion as well. So here's the funding that's relevant to this. So I plan to, in the next 10 minutes or so, tell you about my path in health services research. Again, that's just one way, but hopefully there's some applicable lessons. I'll share some lessons that I've learned about developing a career development plan, and hopefully that'll be of some broader application. And finally, hopefully prompt you to ask some questions during the discussion period specific to your interests, or, you know, you're happy to, I'm happy to take your emails or DMs on Twitter or whatever offline, or I suppose that's online, if you have questions after the webinar is over. So this is a show my kids used to watch. And, you know, as I was a resident and interested in surgical oncology, the conventional wisdom was that you had to go kill some mice or rats, you know, and that was kind of how you matched at a prestigious fellowship. I think that's changed. It was starting to change when I was a resident, but even at that time, there really weren't that many funded health services researchers in surgery at all, not to mention just in surgical oncology. But I think that's changing a lot. And I think certainly our view of what constitutes productive academic output has evolved and is broader than it maybe once was. So, you know, I think that building a funded research career in health services research is obviously very feasible. And I think the support is really there in a way that it hasn't been at any previous time in the past. So I did my academic time during my residency between 2006 and 2009. And then in 2012, finished residency. And at the same time, finished the PhD that I'd started during my research time. And I'd like to tell you that that was like all part of some grand master plan, but it wasn't at all. And I think, you know, one lesson I'd like to convey to all of you is to just be open to opportunities. As it turned out, when I went into the lab, I thought I was going to be working in a tumor immunology lab with Rich Schulich, and I started in a program at the School of Public Health, which was a PhD program called the Graduate Training Program in Clinical Investigation. And as I took some courses in statistics and more quantitative science, it kind of reminded me of some of the stuff I'd done as an engineering major in college. And I kind of realized that that really was the path I wanted to take. And so I, at that point, had enrolled in the PhD program. And, you know, that wasn't my initial intent, but it came with funding, and it was going to take 3 years instead of 2. But at the end of it, you'd have, you know, the PhD training. But I was able to switch and work instead with a mentor who was in health services research. And I think, you know, having some flexibility there in terms of responding to opportunities that come your way is really important. And so I, in 2014, then finished my clinical fellowship and started my faculty position at the University of Michigan. I came in with some kind of vague notion of what I wanted to focus my research agenda on, and sitting down with my research mentor, Justin Dimmick. I mean, our conversation wasn't exactly like this, but it was kind of like this. I mean, I had a plan that really wasn't very good. And, you know, it was rudimentary at best. It was pretty naive. And part of the challenge was to, you know, develop my own plan with the advice of my mentors, and try to turn that into something that was going to be sustainable and really would lead to a funded research career. So as I was thinking about how to really sharpen my research focus and to ask questions that were going to be worthy of funding, some of them included things like, what do you want to study, say, for the next 10 years or so? What do you want to be known for? Who's going to care about it? What audience, do you really want to reach? And does it have to be related to HPB surgery or surgical oncology or surgery at all? And here's maybe the one part of the talk that's specifically relevant to HPB surgery. I think that if you're going to do work in health services research and you only want to talk about liver surgery or pancreatic cancer, you've already kind of restricted your audience to a fairly small group. And so I made the decision that, I would want to focus on surgical care more broadly. And yeah, I would, do some work specifically related to pancreatic surgical care, et cetera. But that if I only focused on that, it would kind of limit my impact and the relevance of the work I was doing. So that's a decision that every individual has to make for themselves, I think. But I think you have to be honest with yourself about what your interests really are. And people use various terms for these things: clinical research versus outcomes research versus health services research. I mean, I think, I always used to sneer at the term outcomes research because I think we all measure outcomes. I think that's what all research is to some degree. But I think over time, it's kind of gotten acquired the definition of being kind of about, retrospective analyses, largely of, institutional series or maybe of some easily available, publicly available databases. The statistics tend not to be terribly sophisticated. And I'm not being pejorative. People make their entire careers on that type of research, and that's fine. I think, however, if you want to do health services research, that requires a slightly different skill set. It's going to require a slightly different commitment of resources and, potentially funding, et cetera. And then, clinical research, and by that I mean, and again, it's all clinical research in some sense, but clinical research in the sense of really clinical studies, and I know Dr. Katz is going to talk about trials, but of course there's other types of clinical studies that you could do as well. And that's yet another way. So I think you really have to be honest with yourself about exactly what you want your research portfolio and your contribution to look like. You need to think about whether you would need funding in order to carry out such a research program. So, in basic science, you really can't sustain a research program without significant funding, usually extramural funding and usually federal. But in outcomes research, you really can. You could cobble together some philanthropic funds, et cetera, and, hire an analyst and buy some data sets, and you could crank out some papers that way. And again, that's totally fine. But I think if you aspire to do something like compete for an R01, then that's going to require a different path. It's also going to depend on your institutional support. So not every institution wants their junior faculty go get a K award, right? Because that's a money loser for the Department of Surgery. And so you have to be sensitive to what your institutional environment is going to be and what the support's going to be for that kind of a path. And then finally, so, what skills do you need to get there? Once you've really defined what you want your research career to look like, what do you need to learn? Do you need to learn how to write grants or not really? Do you need to learn some advanced statistical skills or not really? And so as I was developing my own career development plan, of course, I'd come in already with some statistical training from the PhD and stuff. And so when I started on faculty, I was really kind of thinking about where to go next with that. And I realized that I wanted to focus on the intersection between healthcare policy and delivery, focus on surgery broadly, as I said, from a population health perspective, not just on HPB surgery, thinking about what do health system leaders and policymakers need to know to improve the way we deliver surgical care. And for me personally, as a goal, to use health services research as a tool to understand healthcare delivery and potentially build skills for health system leadership. So this didn't happen overnight, but over the course of many discussions over maybe a year and a half, as I was kind of developing my K award, this is kind of what emerged. And I think that was a very valuable exercise for me in order to really kind of gain some insight into who I really wanted to be and what I really wanted to contribute. People often ask, do I need another degree? And what I would say is that you need skills. So just like Dr. Ye was mentioning, you wouldn't expect somebody to just walk into the surgical clerkship with a PhD and get some kind of advanced placement. Same is true in a wet lab, and the same is true in health services research. You need skills. You need skills because you need the academic rigor in your work. You need the credibility from colleagues and from funding agencies, et cetera. You need that so you can train mentees effectively. And I think you need the skills so you can supervise the staff. I may not do my own statistical analyses anymore, but I've kind of been there, done that. I know some of the pitfalls. I've made all the mistakes. And so when I'm talking to my analyst, I kind of know what questions to ask him or her. And I think unless you've really gotten your hands dirty, you're just never going to have that same in-depth knowledge. It is analogous to developing skills in a wet lab, but you can get skills without a degree. And, I think, again, you need to think about what funding is available to you, what kind of time is available to you, and what your personal goals are. Not everybody needs a degree to do this successfully. I think taking some time with your mentor to figure all this out is really important. For me, this happened during my first couple of years as junior faculty. Some people may come into their junior faculty positions with a much more well thought out plan for what they want to do and who they want to be. I wasn't there yet. It took me a couple of years to figure it out. But I think taking that time was really helpful to me in terms of both guiding my science, but also kind of showing me the ropes, manuscripts and grants. Dory Segeb would call that, the secret handshake. Help you figure out what other people will find interesting, help you figure out who you want to be, and help you figure out then how to get there. I mean, you don't have to do all of this by yourself. And I think it's okay to be a little bit vulnerable and admit that you don't have it all figured out and that you need some help kind of talking through it and figuring out what you want to do and how you want to get there. So while I was figuring all this out and kind of working on the K Award application, I wrote several commentaries and that sort of thing to kind of plant a flag in this area of understanding population health costs as they related to surgery. And I think, a lesson that I would convey to many of you who are interested in these kinds of topics is to just write about things you want to learn more about. Don't be intimidated and think that you have to have some kind of advanced training. Nobody has it. You just get out there and you start learning and ask experts and just start doing it. And you can build that expertise and plant that flag. So starting on the faculty in 2014 and 2016, my K08 was awarded. It all sounded very good in my head, and we had this nice conceptual model, and it was good enough to get funded anyway. As it turned out, the major aim of the work showed that there was basically no effect. The details really aren't important. This was looking at accountable care organizations as they related to surgical care. And, it was kind of a underwhelming study in this respect that we didn't really see any major differences. But, that was actually a valuable exercise for me because it forced me to kind of reconsider some of the presumptions that I had and that I had written my K Award with in mind, and really kind of fix those presumptions prior to putting together ideas for an R01. And so I think, having some persistence, regardless of what research path you choose, is always going to be key. And for me, it prompted me to kind of rethink, well, if we find that ACOs didn't work, why is that? What are the potential barriers and how might one get around those barriers? And that basically became the basis for my R01 application. And so in a way, the fact that my main research goal for my K08 fell flat on its face ended up being kind of a blessing. Again, I didn't walk into this knowing about all this stuff or knowing even exactly what I wanted to do. And as I was going along, I was very fortunate to work with really excellent and talented trainees, some of whom are listed on this page. And we learned a lot of this stuff together. And I think it's okay to admit that. I think especially as a young faculty, you think that all of a sudden, both clinically and academically, you're supposed to have all the answers. And I don't think that's true in either sphere. And so it's okay to be a little bit vulnerable and admit what you don't know, and develop a career development plan to kind of fill those gaps and develop those skills. And you may find that there's going to be trainees doing it right alongside you, and that can be a win-win for everybody. So 4 years on a K08 from 2016 to 2020, and then I had a gap until we were able to get our R01 funded, and fortunately that was awarded this year. And so that's one way of doing it. I would say that the lessons that I hope would be more broadly applicable are to really be honest with yourself about what your interests and your goals are, to be open to other avenues and opportunities at your institution, seek out good mentorship, get the right training, and try to work with smart people, because that will raise your game. So thanks very much, and I'll take questions during the panel discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Nathan. That was a fantastic talk. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and present our next speaker, who I'm sure doesn't really need an introduction, and that's Dr. Matt Katz. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Surgical Oncology at MD Anderson Cancer Center and holds the Lockton Distinguished Chair in Pancreatic Cancer Research. And as many of you know, he has led 2 national cooperative group studies on the effects of chemotherapy and radiation on patients with advanced pancreatic cancer and has run several single institution and multi-institution clinical trials, published extensively, and held numerous leadership roles. He will now provide us with some insight on how to develop an academic career through clinical trials. Dr. Katz.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. And it's great to be part of this. I've learned a lot already and really enjoyed the talk. So thanks. So I'm going to be talking about clinical trials, I think. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about clinical trials. And yeah, we're asked to kind of give our experience. And I'm going to touch on a few things in this talk. First of all, the training that's required to be a quote unquote clinical trialist, although I'm not sure I like that term. Crucial forks in the road and how they were navigated, membership in cooperative groups, which I'll spend a fair amount of time on, and then general tips and tricks specific to trials leadership. So I won't go in this order, but I hope to give some brief discussion with respect to each of these four objectives. So the first thing I'd say is that trials are not easy to design and they're not easy to run. There's a lot of regulatory and compliance that comes with running clinical trials that those who are not familiar with clinical trials are unaware of or only cursorily aware of. Even accruing patients to clinical trials can be very difficult. There's disruptions to practice. It takes a long time to consent. Requires lots of extra visits potentially. There's scheduling issues, again, regulatory issues as it pertains to your practice. And the whole process can be, unfortunately, extraordinarily political. But I think running trials can be really rewarding. It offers you the opportunity to really shape the cutting edge of medicine. I think it's a great avenue for junior faculty because as you grow your practice, you grow your research program, and additional patients mean enlarging both your practice and research program. You can of course contribute new knowledge. It allows opportunity for networking, improving patient care, opportunities to publish, of course. Provide access in your community, in some cases, to therapies that they may not otherwise have access to, and sometimes you can even profit. So I'll go into some of those things in greater depth, but first, want to consider actually what is a clinical trial, and we generally speak as surgeons of trials very globally. But really, there's a specific definition for clinical trials, and this is the definition that the NIH proposes. A clinical trial is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So running clinical trials means you're doing this kind of research where you are actively performing prospective study of patients who are assigned to different treatment interventions. There are many types of clinical trials, and I won't go over them, but I will say that there are three overlapping classifications, I guess I'd say, of clinical trials. The first being investigator-initiated trials. These are trials that are conducted on the basis of an idea that you generated and that you somehow fund. Industry-sponsored trials, and that can be your idea or the company's idea, but generally the company funds or industry funds. And then cooperative group trials, and I'll spend most of the time, I think, on this. These are generally your idea, and the group through the NIH funds those types of trials. So what do you need to run a trial? The first thing, of course, you need is a good question. And there's, being surgeons, we have no limit to the number of questions we encounter on the wards, in the operating room from mentors, et cetera. This is the easy part. Coming up with questions is really the easy part. But you can't run trials based only on having good questions. You have to have questions that are feasible to answer. You have to have questions that are interesting to not only yourself, but to peers and to society in general. You have to have novel questions. So the trials you run need to extend knowledge. You can't, personally, I think it's unethical to run trials that are that do not extend knowledge in a meaningful way. Trials need to be ethical, and of course, your question needs to be relevant and practice changing. And I want to focus on this because I don't think enough people who get involved in clinical trials focus enough on whether they have whether their purported trial is feasible. You really have to think about feasibility of trials critically. You can have the greatest idea that you've ever had in your mind, but whether you can translate that to a trial is a completely different animal. You have to have the patient resources, you have to have collaborators, the technical expertise, funding, and time. It turns out that many trials which are conducted never finish successfully. And about a quarter of trials that are run in the United States actually terminate prior to completion of accrual. That can be for a number of reasons, whether that be because a difficulty accruing, the treatment is either clearly efficacious or not efficacious, absence of funding, study drugs are toxic, what have you. But the long story short is that you really have to think in terms of feasibility when you're trying to translate your great question into a trial, or else your trial is not likely to succeed. Of trials that succeed, a great proportion of trials don't actually end up getting reported. So this was a study that looked at trials in clinicaltrials.gov, and about 40% of the trials reported or registered to that database never actually reported out. So if you're going into clinical trials and you're running trials and you don't either complete them or report them, that clearly hurts you from an academic standpoint. But I would also argue that it's ethically problematic, because unlike other types of research, you are actually taking patients who have better things to do with their time and accruing them to studies which may be toxic to them, and then all their work and all their effort and is for naught. So really, it's important that if you are thinking about running trials, you spend a significant time on assessing feasibility, so you don't get into this issue. So that's all to say that a good question isn't nearly enough, and there's a lot of things you need in order to translate good questions into good clinical trials. And the first of those things is skills. So I kind of figured this out on the job when I started, which wasn't frankly that long ago. There weren't that many opportunities to learn about clinical trial design and running clinical trials outside of the AACR Vail course. That was pretty much it. Now almost every society has at least one clinical trials course. ACS has one, AHPBA has, everyone has one, and I've spoken at most of them, and most of them are pretty good. So I would encourage anyone who has an interest in this area in seeking out one of these programs. There are master's programs and other degree programs available in clinical research, although I don't think that is absolutely necessary. You have a lot of institutions and departments have their own clinical trials course. I know my department, for example, has a clinical trials course for the fellows that is reasonably well attended. And again, you can get these skills on the job, but it takes a long time, and there's faster and ways to do it. You need a lot of support, whether that's from your chair or section chief. You need supportive colleagues, because if you think your idea is good and your colleagues do not, your idea is doomed. And frankly, you need friends, because a lot of getting trials done is about, I'll accrue to your study and you accrue to my study. I mean, that's how this stuff kind of works. Unfortunately, it's not only about the quality of the science. It's really important that you act as a good citizen and enroll on trials that your friends have. Takes a lot of money, time, personnel, and other resources. We'll talk about that. And then above all, it takes patience. So, getting involved in trials as a very early career surgeon can be a little bit more difficult until you've developed a practice that can support the patients that you need to accrue to your studies. So again, nothing is free. Your time is not free. Your team is not free. All the visits, space, diagnostics, therapeutics, et cetera. None of this stuff is free when you run a trial. So you have to really think long and hard about whether the great idea you have is feasible from a support and financial standpoint. And particularly if you're doing trials outside the cooperative group mechanism, you better be a good fundraiser, and you better be into grants. You have to do grantsmanship. It's the same kind of thing that you encounter in the other types of research. You need money to run good trials, typically. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about cooperative groups because I know that was of interest. And I won't go too into what the cooperative groups are, but suffice it to say that the cooperative groups are groups of institutions that contribute patients to group-conducted clinical trials. As of a few years ago, there were over 14,000 individual investigators that were registered to one of the NCTN cooperative groups. And those cooperative groups place more than 25,000 new patients into cancer trials each year. So, even if you don't have a huge practice, or even if you're studying a rare disease, the cooperative group mechanism can be a great way for early career investigators to do some good science. This is the structure of the NCTN. I won't belabor it too much, but suffice it to say that there are several cooperative groups in the United States and one in Canada. One of the cooperative groups in the United States is focused on pediatrics. The other four are adult. And most, if not all, of the centers that you work in belong to probably one, maybe two, maybe even more, but typically one of these cooperative groups. So what you should do if you're interested in getting involved in the cooperative groups, first thing is to find out what group or groups your institution is involved in, find out who the local PI of the group is at your center, and meet with that person and see how you can get involved. There's lots of advantages to being involved in the cooperative groups. Again, of course, scientific contributions. Networking is huge. This can be particularly important for junior faculty in smaller centers who may not have a huge, cancer or HPB community within their hospital. This can provide an incredible source of mentorship, outside the hospital. Typically, the cooperative groups offer leadership training that, in my experience, is excellent. They offer RFAs for funding, so they themselves offer grants, and particularly to early career investigators. So that's a great opportunity. And then lots of options for career development. It may be that you can run a trial through a cooperative group, although I will tell you that it's, you know, relatively few individuals who get involved in cooperative groups actually run a trial as a PI. But as you'll see, that doesn't mean that you can't make an impact. But there are advantages to running trials through the cooperative groups, particularly as it pertains to HPB. Most centers don't see enough liver, pancreas, cholangio, patients to conduct meaningful trials. And so this can be a great opportunity for studying the diseases that we are particularly interested in. That being said, there have been several trials that have been run by surgeons. The AHPBA was a great group that folded, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, but there are 2 pancreas trials run through that. The Alliance has run 2 with myself and Syed Ahmad. Now there's a current pancreas trial led by Christina Ferroni and Akhil Chawla, and Shishir Mithal is running a cholangio trial through ECOG. So, there is precedent here for surgeons to be PIs and even national PIs of clinical studies through the cooperative group mechanism. However, the process is extraordinarily political. I don't think you can do it alone. You really need strong mentorship. You need to dedicate a lot of time and effort to the cause. And the whole NCTN network can be pretty difficult to navigate. It's a tough system, particularly as a junior faculty, to kind of get a hold of. And it takes some time just to kind of feel your way through the system. So you're at a point where you can start proposing studies. This is actually the process map for submitting a trial through, I want to say it was ECOG. I can't remember where I got this study, but I thought it was so completely absurd that I had to use it as a slide. But this is the long and short of how to get a trial through a cooperative group. Taking it a little bit, from a more refined view, the concept development process involved in putting a trial through in the cooperative group, through the cooperative groups, is very time intensive, has multiple areas for success, but also a number of areas for failure. And the whole process of just developing a trial from your initial great idea to an approved concept, as you'll see, unfortunately, can take years. It can take months, but it can also take years. It certainly won't take weeks. So I guess one thing I'd say about cooperative group studies is, this is not a full-time job. You got to have a side gig, and whether that be health services research, investigator-initiated trials at your own shop, lab research, what have you. You can't do this in isolation. You need a mentor. This was the email that I initially wrote to Peter Pisters, who was at the time the GI committee chair at AHPBA. And I basically said, look, I really want to get into AHPBA and take part in this stuff. Let me know what I can do, and I'm in. And that's really all it takes to get started, is finding a mentor that will kind of take you under their wing and shepherd you through the process. The next step is showing up at an annual meeting at one of the groups of your choice, and then starting to get involved. And so the way I started getting involved was doing correlative trials or correlative studies, I should say, for trials that had already been done. And this was a study we did on quality control in one of the previously conducted pancreatic cancer trials. I looked through the data with this group. We used op reports and path reports to essentially evaluate the quality control of the trial, and that turned into a paper. But more importantly, it showed that I was a closer and we could get things done, and then that led to more opportunities, as these things typically do. Although you might not submit a trial through the group, there are other extraordinary opportunities that may arise in education, health policy, publications. We've done a ton of work on quality control in cancer surgery that started actually with that previous publication that we did through the Alliance, and then transitioned that to the American College of Surgeons, and then into the COC. So all of this stuff that some of you may be familiar with respect to operative standards that are now required for COC accreditation, that kind of started in large part through this kind of work, and that work began really in the cooperative groups. Doing a trial is possible, but it takes time. My trials have focused on, quote unquote, borderline resectable pancreatic cancer, based on a retrospective paper I did with Doug Evans in 2008. I came to my first ACOSOG meeting in 2010 when I graduated, and based on that initial stuff we had done, Mitch Posner and I proposed an initial stab at a study for borderline resectable pancreatic cancer in 2010. That study morphed over a period of years and ultimately led to two cooperative group studies, but they looked nothing like the study I proposed in 2010. And it's been 12 years of this stuff, and it's taken quite a bit. So again, you can't do this as your full-time job. You have to have, you got to do this kind of as a side gig. So all that's to say that I think there's a number of reasons for surgeons to get active in clinical trials. I think it's extraordinarily rewarding. It's extraordinarily fun. It can be extraordinarily collaborative. But that said, it's not easy to do, whether you do it in the cooperative groups or outside the cooperative groups. Running trials is really tough, and it takes more than just good ideas. It takes training, I think. It takes resources. It certainly takes patience, and it takes good mentors. But if you'd like to get involved, I highly recommend this as your path or among your paths. And I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions either here or offline about how I can help make that happen. So thanks again. This has been a great webinar, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katz. Thank you for those incredible insights. I pledge to never refer to you as a clinical trialist. Well, we have to move on to our next speaker. It's really my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Winter from University Hospital Case Western in Cleveland. He's the division director of the surgery in the Department of Surgery there. He's also a funded pancreatic cancer surgeon scientist whose laboratory studies adaptive mechanisms to nutrient deprivation in the pancreas tumor microenvironment. Personally, Jordan has been an amazing mentor and confidant of mine, and I'm really delighted that he has agreed to share his perspectives on how to build an effective research team and a motif. Dr. Winter.
Thank you, Josh and Alex and AHPBA. I want to thank all the speakers who have given awesome talks. And I am going to try and live up to the standard. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Do you see it, Josh? Do you see my slides?
Good.
Okay. So I am, so I titled this talk, 6 Ingredients Needed to be a Successful Surgeon Scientist. It's going to be a little bit laboratory centric, but I think it's applicable. I want to say just at the outset that I love what I do. I think we are so lucky to be able to do research, take care of patients, to operate. It's hard, it's difficult. We fail every single day, but you know, and I'll mention some of those challenges, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. So I want to try and have a little, put off a touch of inspiration that we're truly blessed. This is going to be a macro talk, and I want to begin by putting up this slide of 9 individuals. Take a look at this group of people. Look at their names. These are the 9 Nobel Prize winners in medicine who have been surgeons. They're weighted towards the early part of the 20th century, true. In fact, the first quarter of the 20th century, a quarter of Nobel laureates in medicine were surgeons. We have a rich heritage of highly impactful researchers. And let that also be an inspiration to all of us that we can really make a difference if the circumstances are right and we approach it the same way. These people have made an amazing difference. In fact, there's one particular surgeon here that means something particularly special to me. And that is the guy in the middle who discovered insulin. Some of you may know, but in my 3rd year of residency, I was 29 years old. I developed polydipsia and polyuria and was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes as a 29-year-old. I would not be here today giving you this talk. I'd be dead if it wasn't for Fred Banting, a surgeon. Emily Wapnick is a writer, and she gave a wonderful TED Talk. It's had over 8 million views, and she talks about this phenotype called a multi-potentialite. What is that? It's somebody with diverse interests across numerous domains. Someone with diverse interests across, that is a surgeon scientist. And the reason why multi-potentialites are so important, the reason why surgeon scientists are so important is, as Emily describes, innovation happens at the intersection of disparate fields. Surgeons can win Nobel Prizes. Surgeons can make great discoveries because we see things differently. We ask different questions. We look at the same questions from different angles, and the cancer field needs us to ask these questions. It is critically important that you all go into surgical science. Otherwise, discoveries will not happen that would happen otherwise. All right, here we go, my 6 tips. So start with why. So some of these are a little bit softer, but they're all really important. This I lead off with because it's actually the most important. Simon Sinek wrote one of my favorite books. It's paradigm changing for me in terms of my perspective on professionalism, on business, on organizations. Write this book down, get it, and read it. Start with why. He wrote this book to influence leaders. But I think it's important for scientists. When you show up to work and you're doing research, you have to know why you're doing it. And that why, it doesn't matter what it is. The only thing that's important from my perspective is it has to fulfill a higher purpose. It could be that you want to make a fundamental discovery that impacts patients' lives. It could be that you want to train the next generation of scientists. It can mean that you have an insatiable curiosity for how the world works, but it has to have a deeper meaning. It can't be because you want to get promoted. It can't be because you want to make more money, because there's too much failure. It's too difficult. We have to work too hard. You will burn out. If you don't have a stronger reason that drives you, and you need to think about that reason every single day, and you need to share it with your team, with your colleagues, with your direct reports, with your lab, that this is your mission and you have to be mission driven. I think that's really, really important. Mentorship. We've already seen this this slide once. I think when I thought Hari was stealing one of my slides, but you know, we overuse in surgery the term mentorship. I think in some ways it's become a little bit cheapened. I want to tell you what I think mentorship means for a surgeon scientist, and I'm talking specifically about a laboratory surgeon scientist. Any achievement that I've had as a surgeon scientist, I believe is 50% because of me and 50% because of a guy named Jonathan Brody, who is my mentor. That's a huge chunk of my success that I am attributing to somebody else. So John and I corresponded or communicated every single day during the first 7 years of my faculty experience, every single day, either in person, by text, by phone, by email. He would read every single one of my grants 3 to 4 times before I submitted it. Once every couple of months, we'd be in my office from 7 o'clock to 10:30 at night, crafting and recrafting and fighting over my specific aims. John was there to tell me, give me the hard truth when I was going down the wrong path. He was there to pick me up and hug me when I needed it. He was there to co-mentor my trainees with me. John, who's a PhD scientist, his laboratory meeting schedule was not a regular meeting. It was completely, you get a lab of 10, and it was completely scheduled around my clinical schedule. It changed like week to week. That's a mentor. Somebody who cares about your success more than their own. That's uncommon. And I want you to think, if you have a mentor, anything close to that. That's who we want to be to our trainees. And that's what we need as junior faculty trying to embark on a legitimate surgeon scientist career. Number 3, you have to work your ass off. I mean, you've got to work. This guy, Scott Galloway, is a great thinker. He's a business professor at NYU. He's written a bunch of books. Read them. They're really interesting. This is a short one, The Algebra of Happiness. And he offers a lot of great nuggets in this book. You can get through it in a night. And I'm just going to read to you a few of his quotes, which I think are extremely poignant and insightful. The whole world does not belong to the big, but to the fast. The slope of the trajectory of your career is set in the first few years. You need to burn a lot of fuel if you want to succeed. And you need to burn it early. You're not going to make up that time 5, 8 years into your career. You've got to start off strong. And by strong, I mean working really, really hard. Work-life balance, right? We all need a work-life balance. Here's what Scott says. If balance is your priority in your youth, then you need to accept that unless you are a genius, you may not reach the upper rungs of economic security. And I'll actually reframe it for us. You may not achieve great success as a surgeon scientist and get an R01. And Scott also says, I think it's safe for all of us to assume that we are not Jay-Z or Tom Brady. And by the way, those guys, even though they're uber talented, they work really, really hard too. You want to cover more ground in less time than your peers. This is partially built on talent, but mostly built on strategy and endurance. You've got to accept the principle or embrace the principle of compounded interest, right? You know about this in business, where if you're earning interest every year, that interest is off of a greater pool of principal. And so after several years, you're at a multiplier effect, advancing at a further pace. That's true with how hard you work as a scientist. It's compounded interest. So the harder, if you have two people, one's working 40 hours a week and one's working 80 hours a week, I mean, that person's 40 hours ahead after week one, but after a year, they're more than 40 times 365 ahead. That distance separates in such a substantial way, so fast, that this is the way that you get ahead. I know that's an intense message, but I think it's the truth. And I want to give it to you the way that I really believe is going to set you up for success. Nothing wonderful, I mean, really fantastic, will happen without taking a risk and subjecting yourself to rejection. Serendipity is a function of courage. That means we make our own luck, and that's true. There's actually data that support that. We make our own luck. All right, number 4, you need big ideas. Don't go after small ideas. I just read a grant. I'm on study section next week on the bet family class of proteins. The scientists have been working on bet proteins for 7 or 8 years. These proteins have failed as targets in the clinic. The chances that this is going to substantially move the needle in the next 10 years are so low. Based on lack of innovation, I couldn't advance this grant forward. Think of big ideas, and if you're working on something after 3 or 4 ideas and it's not working, take the Hari Nathan rule and respin it and ask a new question. So here are some ideas that can help you come up with big ideas. You can solve big problems, look for big questions, but offer new solutions, take new strategies of attacking them. Look at old solutions into completely new ways. I recently read a grant where somebody said retinoblastoma protein is not a tumor suppressor. It's an oncogene. And that's really important because there's drugs that activate RB and we could be promoting metastases. That's innovative. Solve a big problem that no one else is trying to solve. Go to a solar system and look where nobody else is looking. I'd much rather look there. I mean, it's important to turn a cold tumor hot, but aren't a lot of people looking at that question? So what's your process to be creative? Nobody talks about that, but I think we need to think about how can we maximize our creativity? Read, 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 set time aside to read. Read in your field, read high impact papers, and read outside your field to get other ideas. There's actual data to show that walking helps creativity. So, I often ask people when I'm interviewing them, when you're walking your dog or you're going for a job, what do you think about? This is how a lot of ideas are generated. I'm not going to ask you what you think about in the shower, but I will suggest that you carve some time out for scientific exploration, because how many great ideas come during a shower? You might waste some hot water, but the science world will appreciate it. You have to spend some time in dedicated thought. You've got to carve out time where you just think undistracted. And then the intersection of fields. Emily Wampnick, multi-potentialite, go become an expert in 2 different domains, microbiome and metabolism, RNA and vaccine. Oh yeah, that saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the last 3 years. Be an expert in 2 things and be unique at how you blend them and match them together. So Time management, really important. Really important to have your time protected. If you're going to be a laboratory scientist, and many of you on the call are not, I recognize that. But if you're going to spend time doing laboratory research and writing grants, this is where you need to be. The majority of your time needs to be doing research. If you want to be, you're competing against people who are 100% doing research. So you have to be at least the majority of your time. And, you know, you're not going to be thought of as the coolest person in your department. The residents are going to think that the person that does 4 or 5 major hepatobiliary cases a week are much cooler than you. Are you okay with that? By the way, this is sort of just me just gratuitously throwing it in there. A lot of departments are not going to offer this. They're not going to afford this. This is what I believe a 70% surgeon scientist needs to be successful in their first 5 years. A package of $500 to $1,000 to $1 million, excluding your salary. I just want to put that out there so that you guys have a benchmark when you're thinking about this. Number 6, develop a high functioning lab culture. This is true for any leader in any organization. Culture trumps strategy. We hear that, right? Culture trumps strategy. Do people walk that walk? Do you ever hear people talking about culture as much as they should? These are Harvard professors that wrote this book, Corporate Culture and Performance, almost 30 years ago now. They did a study of 200 organizations, and they looked at high-performing companies versus low-performing companies, and they figured out what culture is worth for productivity. And if you guys have access to chat, I'm going to look at the chat. I'm going to ask you now, what do you think? Let me just pull up my chat because I need to see this. I want to know. I'm going to stop my sharing for a second just so I have the chat. What do people think culture is worth to the bottom line? Put the number in the chat. How much percentage increase will that make your company in productivity to the bottom line? I'm talking about profit, operating income, surplus. Is it 20% to the bottom line, 30%? How much do you think a high-performing culture is relative to a low-performing culture in terms of profit? Put a number, percentage in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of guesses, 30 to 50%. Let me pull up my screen again. If I can figure out how to do this, Hari. Okay. Okay, hold on.
We have a wide range, Jordan. I started with 10 to 20, and then we have Tim Newhook saying 100, and then there's all sorts of ranges in between.
Okay, cool. All right, so
we got to be the bookends, Josh.
I'm gonna blow your minds now. So let me see if I can find. Hari just taught me how to do this. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So culture to the bottom line. 756%. That's what these guys found. So that means 7x. Your profit will increase 7x. Is there any strategic intervention that anybody has ever proposed that results in 756? This is really all we should be focusing on in our organizations, on our teams, and definitely in our labs. How we get a great culture is a different discussion and a different talk, but really it focuses on connecting with people, building trust, people first, and that's how you build a great culture. This is a great book, The Culture Code, Dan Coyle. Definitely worth a read. You'll all love it. Okay, so in summary, Surgeon scientist is a noble pursuit. Don't be afraid of it. Do it. What it takes to succeed. Know your why. Know why you come to work every day. You need next level mentorship, not just a mentor, but 3 levels up. You need a super duper mentor. Hard work is an understatement of what it takes to succeed. Creativity is a premium. Find ways to be creative and dedicate time to bolster your creativity. Resist being seduced or overwhelmed by the clinic. Really make sure that you're giving enough love and attention to research. And build a team of high character people so that they can implement and scale your vision. Have multiple people that believe in your mission, believe in your vision, and then you can accomplish great things. That's it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. That was incredible. Goosebumps. But you know, in the interest of time, we're gonna move forward to the remainder of the talks, and if we have time at the end, we may even go over a little bit. And in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next 2 speakers, and we'll leave the Q&A for the end. So, Alex, you want to introduce our next speaker?
I think Dr. Maker wanted to go next, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead. That's okay. Oliver's okay. Dr. Bogler's
Okay.
okay with it. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So our next speaker is Dr. AHPBA Maker. He's the division chief of the Division of Surgical Oncology at UCSF. He's a funded surgeon scientist studying mechanisms of immune evasion and liver metastasis, and also developing novel biomarkers of malignant transformation in pancreatic cystic neoplasms. He's funded by multiple agencies, and we're delighted to learn about his advice regarding navigating the funding pipeline for early career HPB surgeons and writing for success. Dr. Maker.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Josh. Hopefully you can hear me and the slides are projecting. Great. Well, you know, it's a pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues on the call. Fantastic talks. I'm learning a ton. And, you know, Jordan and Hari both had this picture of Mentor from the Iliad and the Odyssey there. And I think we all stole that slide from Murray Brennan at some point. But, you know, Jordan's a mentor even for me, and many of the colleagues on this call are mentors for me. So, you know, this is just a great pleasure to be here. And I appreciate Josh and Alex and the AHPBA for the invitation. So I'll try and keep this high level, practical and short, given that we're getting short on time. And the charge I was given by Josh and Alex was to discuss the writing for success component. And I believe Oliver is going to talk about things from the funder perspective. But I'll talk about writing for success. And a lot of this is going to build on some of the themes that have already been mentioned. Dr. Jen Ye talked a little bit about timelines for grants and who to apply for. Dr. Winter talked a little bit about asking why. Phenomenal book by Simon Sinek. And for those that don't like to read, he has some YouTube videos as well on that book that help with writing immensely. And Hari Nathan also talked a little bit about writing. So I won't repeat things they've already said, but I'll try and highlight on how to help you write to get your grants. The biggest piece of advice I have is to play to your strengths. What is your superpower? What is it that you have that's unique and that you can capitalize on? And Dr. Winter talked a little bit about this, which is finding your why, answering a problem in a different way that perhaps only you can answer. So what is your strength? If you're not a single cell RNA-seq trained person that can do all the bioinformatics and understand it and has done a postdoc in it, well, then writing an entire specific aim about single cell RNA-seq is probably not playing to your strengths. That doesn't mean it can't be a method in what you want to do, or that you can't have collaborators and experts to help you do some of those things. But when you want to write a grant that's going to get funded, it has to be clear that this is something that can be done in your hands, and you are much more likely to write an exciting grant, one that you're passionate about sitting down and writing and rewriting many times, if it's something that you know a lot about and that you're passionate about. I mean, I was looking recently at my last R01 submission, and the approach section was version 35, right? I mean, if you're going to sit down and write 35 versions of something, it better be something that you enjoy sitting down to do, and something that you enjoy thinking about and is your strength. So what is our strength in general? For people on this call, your strength is that you're a surgeon. Okay, you may have many other strengths, whether they be in statistics, specific techniques, a postdoc that you did in a lab, or health services research or education. You may have many other strengths, but what you have that nobody else has that's applying for grants on that committee, or at least few people have, and you can see the data from what Dr. Ye showed earlier, is that you operate on people. And there's another slide that Dr. Winter had where he showed the Nobel Prize winners. Well, this was the one just before Joe Murray. So this is one of the only ones from the color picture era, Charles Huggins. And what he said is, with blood on my hands, I can discover. Seated at my desk, I have no chance. Your superpower, our superpower, is that we are holding these things in our hands, and we are going to ask questions that by definition are translational and are high impact. And so, you know, I think the greatest chance of success in writing grants is to ask questions and to write about things that are directly related to what you do on a day-to-day basis. If you are a melanoma surgeon, then writing a grant on thyroid cancer may not be as relevant to your superpowers as trying to bring together your clinical interests and your research interests. Now, many of us on this call sit on NIH study sections, and when you write any grant, whether it's for NIH, DoD, society, the general format and what you are graded on are these 5 major categories: significance, innovation, approach, investigator, and environment. And what I can share with you is that at study section, there's really only 2 of these sections that really have any large bearing for the vast majority of grants on what the final score will be. Because in the end, the final score is all that matters. It's one score. And those 2 categories are significance and approach. And so these are where you should spend your time writing. These are things you should get good at writing. For significance, we talked about playing to your strength, and the significance is usually not an issue if you ask the right question with the translational bend, and ask a question, again, that only a surgeon can answer. Any study section gets very excited when they see a clinician, especially if they have a scientific bend to it, whether that be a data scientific bend or whether it's a basic science-based scientific bend. But the idea is that the question you're asking is going to make a difference in patients' lives, and that's the significance component. The other component, of course, is the approach, and that's where writing takes time and practice. But you have to really spend some time crafting that approach in a digestible way. It becomes a temptation for the approach to become a laundry list of experiments or techniques that one is going to employ to help answer that question. And those grants are very difficult to read. They end up seeming somewhat organized when you're writing them, but they don't tell the story. And so how does one avoid that trap? By the specific aims page. That specific aims page is so crucially important because that should tell the significance, and it should tell the approach in a very logical, storytelling way and in a digestible way. So how do you make that specific aims page stand out from the crowd? This is critically important. This is where I would say 80% of your time should be spent when you're planning to write for a grant, getting a nice, polished, specific aims page. Well, no one's born knowing how to do this. And There are many specific aims workshops. Your own institution will have them. Even if they're offered by the School of Public Health, for example, go to them. It doesn't even so much matter what the content of the grant is. It's how to write a good specific aims that is organized, tells a story, and shows the significance in the approach. Have many people read your specific aims page. Your mentors, if you're blessed to have mentors like some on this call that will meet with you on daily or weekly or even monthly basis, your mentor is critical to help with the specific aims. I'm happy to read any of them, as I'm sure are any people on this call, and have many different types of people read them. The types of people that would be on a study section, so you're going to want some either basic or translational scientists to read them. If yours is a PCORI or an HRQ, to have people in biostatistics or the School of Public Health read them for you. Have your own fellow clinicians read them for you. Have your family members read them for you. My spouse is tired of trying to read my grants for me, but she gives me many great recommendations, even though she may not know the content of the details of what I'm writing. But there is no replacing going to these workshops. I went to so many of these I started during residency, then during fellowship. As a junior attending, I went to every one of those brown bag luncheons and opportunities, even at other schools, for example, in public health, engineering, wherever there were, to try and learn how to do that better. The second piece of advice that I have for writing, especially your first grant, is this book published by the NIH. It's a workbook, and there are templates in this book that actually help take away the fear of sitting down and looking at a blank page. It'll actually have a template of a specific aims page, a template of an approach with transitions and different paragraphs. And it really can help you focus an outline of how you're going to translate what you want to say into something that's digestible and will be attractive and, most importantly, clear to a grant reader. There are many grants that I read at study section that, I used to think I'm just, not a smart enough person to understand this. I'm just a surgeon. I don't get it. And the more I look at those grants, the more I realize the fault is more in the grant writing, which is why it's unclear. Anybody should be able to understand what is in the grant, not just people that are experts in your field. And that's how to best get it funded. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what agencies, because this was covered a little bit by prior speakers, but needless to say, identifying some of your goal agencies for ultimately where you want to get your ultimate funding, if it's an R01 or if it's a DoD impact award or if it's an HRQ or PCORI federal grant. The reason it's important to identify where your quote unquote home is going to be is because having a relationship with the scientific officers and the program officers is actually critically important. Dr. Katz talked about how political getting clinical trials off the ground are. Well, those politics exist in these grants very much as well. And politics in the sense that it's not a blinded process. None of this is blinded. When you submit your grant, again, 1/5 of your score is investigator. So they're looking at your resources, where you trained, who you are, who your colleagues are, who you collaborated with. And many of them in the room may even be either people that know you or know of you or are familiar with your institution. And so having a relationship with the program officer can really help direct you towards the right grant mechanisms. And it's a long-term relationship. My program officer that she just retired on January 1st, and it made me so sad because we had a decade-long relationship. And she actually had steered me away a decade ago from a K99 and had directed me towards doing a K08 and then an R01. And over the years we've met, she has steered me in the right direction. And if you end up on a funding bubble, okay, which with the way current margins at the NCI and NIAID are set up, these people can help you navigate that funding, where they can push certain grants one way or the other based on some of these relationships. And so I think that's why knowing where you want to end up is critically important. And then getting your career development award in that track. So you start to create those relationships. Okay, how do you balance manuscript writing with grant writing? And I only have 2 more slides. It comes down to what I think are 3 rubrics. When you're starting out, establish your expertise in the field and write a good review article on the topic that you're going to write your grant on, that is of interest to you, that is answering that question or investigating that question that is your superpower. Then look for another paper that uses the power of big data. We have this huge advantage now that we did not have some time ago. We have NISQIP, we have NCDB for cancer, or SEER for cancer, national inpatient samples, huge institutional databases. The field of health services research has blossomed so much that there are these huge databases that one can tap into. In a pure basic science perspective, there's OncoMine, there's the TCGA, huge genetic databases that otherwise you would have to compile on your own. Ask your question and try and answer parts of it using big data, and that can go towards manuscript writing. So that's another manuscript. The third component is feasibility. So you want to not only establish your expertise, you want to establish your knowledge of the data, and then you have to establish for your grant reviewers that you can do the techniques that you're going to propose in your grant. And that's critically important. Now, if it's a basic science technique, it doesn't matter what the results of the experiment are. If you created a nice technique, a new animal model, a new assay, a modulation of different assays, publish that in a journal like Biotechniques. If it's a new statistical methodology, artificial intelligence collaborations that you're doing or you've developed, publish these techniques. Now, these 3 papers are critically important to help you with your grant writing. How? You can now upcycle all of these manuscripts. And how do you upcycle them? The article that you wrote on the review basically helps you write the entire background and significance component of your grant. It also is very important for the investigator component of the score because it establishes your expertise in the field. The paper that you've written on data, using big data or publicly available data sets to help you answer a question, this is your preliminary data. This is what you can use to not only establish the basis for your hypothesis and support it, but it also contributes to the score of environment, which is to show that you have the ability to work with statisticians to do what needs to be done in your local institution to answer these questions, even using databases that already exist. And for feasibility, the paper that you wrote on this is going to really lay the basis for not only your preliminary data component of your grant, but also significantly to the approach. And with that, I thank you all for your very kind attention, and please feel free to contact me at any time if I can be of help in any way. And thanks so much for the invitation, Josh and Alex, and to the AHPBA.
Thanks so much for that great talk. Thank you, Dr. Bogler, for staying on, and everyone who's stayed over time. We appreciate having you here. So last but not least, we have Dr. Bogler, who is the director of the Center for Cancer Training at the NCI. As the director there, he oversees the NCI's training and career development programs, which prepare scientists both within the NCI and around the country to advance research. Prior to his role at the NCI, he served as the VP of Global Academic Programs at MD Anderson and was Chief Operating Officer at the ECHO Institute. We honestly don't have enough time for me to review his numerous qualifications, contributions, and honors.
Please don't.
But we hope that after his talk, you all go out into the world and get funded, because he's going to help provide those tools of how to navigate the funding pipeline.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I will certainly do my best. And I think you've already received a tremendous volume of great advice from all the previous speakers. I mean, my core message is that the NCI is here to support you throughout your academic career. We have programs and activities that span all the way from middle and high school all the way through to established investigators. And we very much care about the physician scientists and the surgeon scientists in particular. So we have several programs tailored for you folks. The most recent is the early stage science surgeon scientist program that Dr. Zeiger and Dr. Zahir in my center put together for surgeons specifically, but we also recently adjusted the KO8 effort in recognition of the community's wish to do that. So we are very much here to help. My center and the NCI supports a whole host of mechanisms for people in their cancer research training. This slide tries to summarize all that information. Above the graphic, you can see individual awards, and most relevant to this audience, I think, is the KO8. Below the graphic, you can see T32s and K12s, which are also quite important. And then we do have a host of other awards and some diversity-focused awards as well. But I think the KO8 is probably the most interesting to this group, perhaps alongside the K12 where that exists. This is just a quick snapshot of the Center for Cancer Training's portfolio, just to give you an idea of where we invest. We invest about $200+ million a year in fellowships, training awards, and career development awards. You can see that the KO8 is one of our biggest expenditures, beat only by the T32. And we have approximately 240 or so active awards at any one time for KO8. The K12 portfolio is growing. And of course, we have a good number of T32s, some of which are MSTP programs as well. And of course, we have the F30 as well. We support through these mechanisms several hundred folks in training. You can see the breakdown there on the right. The pay lines in training and career development remain relatively robust compared to the R1. The R1 is more competitive, so I think particularly of interest, a 5-year average across the KO8, the success rate is around 20%. Our pay lines are under some pressure, and I can get into that more if we want to in the discussion, but we're trying our best to protect particularly the KO8 mechanism from these pressures, because we think it's such an important mechanism for physician scientists. So what is the KO8? I'm sure you're familiar. It is a mentored career development award for clinical scientists, supposed to support clinical scientists who are doing mentored research. Can be fellows or non-tenured junior faculty with clinical degrees and active licensure. You have to be a US person, citizen, or green card holder. You can do any kind of research that you want. And we do have some, the funding isn't tremendous in terms of volume, but it's not insubstantial, and it can give you protected time. So for surgeons, that requirement is 50% or more. That recently changed. So you can see on the right the breakdown of the people who get these awards, the KO8s. You can see they're all MDs, about half of them are MDs, half of them are MD PhDs. You can see the number of publications people typically have at the time of their successful application, and then also the career stage. There's relatively few people in fellowship. People are either in junior faculty positions or in sort of instructor positions in between. So if you're thinking about the K awards, how can a K award help you? I think hopefully that is obvious, but it supports you in your research career. It marks you as a capable researcher who can develop a project and get it funded, gives you some funding, and it develops your career and scientific skills through this development plan. It allows you to really put together a training plan for yourself that can help you get to where you want to be. Factors in considering what kind of funding to apply for are listed here. I think for this audience, probably most folks will be interested in the KO8. K12s are also an option if they exist at your institution. Provisions and requirements, you can see them here. I've already listed these. I do mention the fact that letters of recommendation need to be submitted electronically, because that does always trip a few people up every cycle. Unfortunately, we don't accept written letters in the body of the application. You just heard from Dr. Maker a very good description of what an R01 structure is. I do want to point to the fact that the K is quite different. This table is helpful. The R01 has the 5 areas that Dr. Maker described. In the K award, the attention is balanced much more between the research and the candidate. It's just as much an investment in you as a person whose career is developing as it is in the research that you propose to do. Now, those two things are intimately interconnected. It's very good to be a great candidate with a terrible research project. So the two are important. I wouldn't disagree with Dr. Maker that the research plan is probably one of the most important issues, but we do instruct our study sections to balance these considerations. One of the other things to think about is that R01s go to a thematically organized study section, so you're talking to a much smaller field, if you will, or representatives of a much smaller field, people will know much more about your research. In the K Awards, you're being reviewed with all the KO8s in that cycle. So the makeup of the study section will be much broader in terms of scientific discipline than you would expect at an R01, and that is just really points to the fact that you need to communicate in a way that is not just for people in your immediate field, but for a broader scientific audience. I did just put at the bottom the link, a link to a blog post. And by the way, I'm happy to share these slides for everybody to receive them. I'm happy to email them to the organizing team after this. But that's a blog post about the RPG review criteria. So NIH is moving, I think, fairly rapidly from the 5 criteria that Dr. Maker described to a 3 criteria system that is supposed to focus more really on what's important, so significance and things like that. So that's just a heads up that if you're not applying for an R01 for a couple of years, you may be applying in a new system. I have a whole series of slides here that, given the time, I'm not going to go through in any detail describing some of the things here. And you've heard some of this already for people, but I would echo what you've been told about the specific aims page. This is the most important page. It is the one page that probably everybody on the study section will read. In most instances, only your assigned reviewers will read your entire application. So it is worth spending some time here. And I won't go again into details. I'll share these slides. If you're preparing it, maybe reviewing them will be helpful. And we do give this presentation in many other venues as well. So if you want to hear it somewhere else, there are links. What I want to emphasize is that a requirement in the K Awards and the fellowships and other training awards as well is really to talk about yourself a little bit in a way that perhaps you don't in an R01. So what the study section will benefit most from is hearing where you want to go scientifically or academically, what kind of a surgeon scientist you intend to be, and why the application that you're submitting is critical to get you there. What is it that you're going to learn, or what skills are you going to acquire? What knowledge will you acquire? What mentorship will you receive during this K Award that will really help you get to that? And I encourage you to tell a somewhat personal story. I think all humans like to understand what another person is trying to accomplish. So speaking about your motivation and how you got to where you are, by the time you make this application, you're a very accomplished individual. You've done a tremendous amount of training. Tell us about why you did that, where you're going, and try to make this personal. I think the watchword here is, if someone could pick up your training plan and just simply search and replace your name with someone else's, and it still makes sense, then it's not a very good plan, because it isn't about you as a person. It's too generic. And there is a temptation, I suspect, in the community of borrowing someone else's KO8 training plan and simply copying and pasting it. Please resist that temptation. Do put some effort into this particular thing. Research strategy you've heard plenty about. There's nothing really new for me to say here. And again, I'll pass these slides on, and then some of these flaws you've also heard about. It's important to have it's key to have an important question, innovative question. In K Awards, you need to worry a little bit, as just like in R1s, but probably a little bit more about being overly ambitious, balance. You may have a big picture about where you want your research team to go over time. Try to carve out what is a feasible amount of work for you as an individual in the years that you're applying for, and make that the focus of your proposal. I've already talked about this. Just be specific, get outstanding letters, strategize with your sponsors and mentors around that. And I would recommend that you spend a little bit of time of knowing your study section. That information is available on the website, so you can discover at least what kind of scientists sit on the study sections. Also, please appreciate that they are busy. And they are not going to read your application, on a relaxed Sunday afternoon with a cup of tea. They're going to probably read it, between other jobs. They may read in an airplane, in the middle of the night. So make your stuff really clean and clear. Spend some time on the communication elements, the figures, the language, so that it becomes really accessible and easy for them to read. That's worth a lot. There's a ton more information on our website, cancer.gov/CCT. If you click on the funding for cancer training link there, you will find pages for all our mechanisms and all the details, and also the program teams that you can reach out to. I do encourage you to reach out to program officers early in your plotting to write an award, find out what's going on. And the other thing I recommend is that you do some sort of competitive analysis. So use the NIH reporter tool to find out what has been funded before for the mechanism and the area that you're working in. Here in this example, I've got K99, but you could put K08 or anything you wanted to that box. If you put the CA in there, that'll give you the NCI grants, and you'll get a list of funded awards and their abstracts that you can read. So you can search with a keyword as well and find out what in your field has recently got funded. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of research and the sort of size of projects that's been going on, that can be sort of some competitive intelligence that might be quite helpful to you. And I'll stop there and be glad to join in with the panel on any Q&A. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Bogler. We, just in the interest of time and being respectful to all the people who signed in, we will skip the Q&A. What I will do is I put in the chat my email address, and maybe Dr. Ganji, you can put in your email address as well. Please feel free to direct your questions to us. Dr. Bogler, you voiced your interest in perhaps sharing your slides with us, and that might be helpful to many members of the audience. Again, I really want to thank the expert group of panelists for your time and effort, and we really appreciate your insights, and we've learned a lot from this, including myself, and hopefully this has been helpful to the members who joined in. And this will also be available on the AHPBA YouTube channel in the not so distant future, so you'll be able to catch this webinar online. Dr. Ganji, any closing comments?
No, I think it'll be available as early as tomorrow in case you want to rewatch it all. But thank you to all our panelists and for those of you who stayed on.
Thanks again and have a good night.